Today we have an exclusive inside look at the internet scam that has been sweeping this country, based out of Nigeria.
Nigerian Instagram influencer who posted pictures of his lavish lifestyle.
Breaching door.
Copy.
Go, go, go! Police, don't move!
June 2020. In one of the most luxurious districts in Dubai, a quiet night was suddenly interrupted by the sound of boots, radios and commands moving through the hallway.
11825, code 6, 105 North Avenue 52.
Within moments, armed officers forced their way into a luxury apartment. What they walked into looked less like a home and more like a monument to wealth. Designer shoes lined the walls. Luxury watches sat neatly arranged in display cases. Expensive bags, jewelry, stacks of cash, and high-end electronics filled the rooms. Parked outside were luxury cars worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Everything inside that apartment told one story: success, power, money, the kind of life millions dream about. But investigators were not there because of luxury. They were there because they believed this lifestyle had been funded by something far more complicated than social media fame. As officers searched the apartment, they began collecting evidence: phones, laptops, hard drives, encrypted devices, financial records. Every item taken into evidence brought them closer to answering a question investigators had been chasing for months. Who was the man behind this empire? To millions of people online, he was already a star. His face was recognizable across continents. His lifestyle attracted admiration, envy, and endless attention. Private jets, five-star hotels, designer fashion, champagne-filled nights. His social media presence painted the image of a man who had made it to the very top, a self-made millionaire living without limits. He called himself Hushpuppi. And to many he became the symbol of luxury success in the digital age. But the investigators who raided that apartment saw something entirely different. They weren't looking at a social media celebrity. They were looking at a trail of digital evidence tied to an international financial crime investigation. An investigation involving millions of dollars, fraud allegations spanning multiple countries, and a network sophisticated enough to target corporations, banks, and major institutions. This was no ordinary fraud case. This was a story involving money, influence, deception, and a carefully crafted public image that had convinced millions. Because perhaps the most unsettling part of this story is not the amount of money involved. It is the fact that everything happened in plain sight.
You want to buy a car tonight? Not really. I was expecting to see the rates, but they said the rates are not here yet. I'm interested in the rates. I want to buy one of those rates.
The luxury was public, the fame was public, the lifestyle was public. Yet behind the photos, the expensive cars, and the carefully curated image, investigators believed something else was operating. Something structured, something calculated, something global. And what they discovered during that raid would transform public perception forever. It would force people to ask a question that still sparks debate today. Was Hushpuppi truly the mastermind behind a global fraud empire? Or was he only one visible face in a much larger network? Tonight, we open the case file. This is the rise and fall of Hushpuppi. To understand how Ramon Abbas became Hushpuppi, we need to go back. Long before the designer brands, before the luxury hotels, and before millions of people knew his name, before the private jets and before the Rolls Royces, or before the carefully curated image of wealth, there was simply a young man from Nigeria trying to find his place in a world where money often determined how much respect you received. Ramon Olorunwa Abbas, later known globally as Hushpuppi, was born and raised in Nigeria. Much about his early life remains difficult to verify with certainty. Some accounts describe a modest upbringing. Others paint a picture of a young man who grew up watching the harsh contrast between wealth and poverty that exists in many parts of Nigerian society. And perhaps that contrast is important to understanding this story. In many communities, success is not just admired, it is visible, it is displayed. People notice what you wear, they notice the car you drive, they notice where you live, they notice where you eat. Status speaks, and for many ambitious young people, financial success can begin to represent far more than money. It becomes freedom, security, power, recognition, validation. For Ramon Abbas, wealth appeared to become something deeply personal.
My mama suffer past Buhari wife. We being children, we suppose they fly private jets. But we no fly private jets. I suffer, Okada don't jam me so many times. Moto don't jam me.
Not just something to possess, but something to embody. Those who later followed Hushpuppi online often focused on the luxury, but luxury itself was never the full story. Luxury was language. It communicated success before a single word was spoken. A watch could speak, a car could speak, a designer outfit could speak, and what they said was simple. I have made it. I matter. I belong among the elite. That desire for status would become central to the identity he later built. But ambition alone does not explain what happened next. There are countless people who dream of wealth, countless people who want success, countless people who chase recognition. Yet very few understand one powerful truth that would eventually work in Hushpuppi's favor. Perception can shape reality. If enough people believe you are successful, they begin to treat you as successful. Doors open, trust increases, influence grows. And once influence grows, opportunity follows. This is where Ramon Abbas appeared to think differently. He seemed to understand that in the modern world, image could become currency, and few platforms rewarded image more than social media. But before social media elevated him, there were still unanswered questions. How did a man whose early background remained relatively unknown begin moving through circles associated with extraordinary wealth? Where did the money come from? What business created such wealth? What investments produced such rapid financial growth? Those questions would follow him for years, and despite the attention he received, clear answers rarely emerged. What did become clear was his growing obsession with luxury culture, high fashion, exclusive brands, elite lifestyle, prestige. He gravitated towards symbols associated with the ultra-wealthy, not merely enjoying expensive things, but embracing the entire culture surrounding them, because luxury does something psychologically powerful. It creates distance from ordinary life, distance from struggle, distance from the past, and sometimes, for people chasing reinvention, that distance can become intoxicating. Ramon Abbas was no longer simply trying to be wealthy. He was building something bigger, an identity, a new version of himself, one designed for attention, one designed for admiration, one designed to command respect. And once that transformation began, there was no turning back. The name Ramon Abbas gradually became less visible. Another identity was taking shape, an identity the world would soon recognize. Hushpuppi, a name that would become associated with extravagant luxury and impossible wealth. But the most fascinating part of his rise wasn't the money, it was the speed. At some point, obscurity gave way to visibility. Visibility became influence, and influence became power. The transformation felt almost sudden to outside observers. One moment, relatively unknown. The next, photographed in luxury stores, expensive hotels, and elite social circles. For many watching from the outside, the rise felt extraordinary, almost unbelievable. And maybe that is what made the story so compelling, because people are naturally drawn to transformation. They want to believe in sudden success. They want to believe someone can rise from obscurity and reach extraordinary heights. It fuels aspiration. It fuels admiration. It fuels curiosity. But admiration often delays scrutiny. People tend to ask fewer questions when they are captivated by success. And that is where the next chapter of this story becomes critical. Because Ramon Abbas was no longer just chasing wealth. He was learning how to manufacture perception on a massive scale. And the tool that would amplify that perception beyond anything imaginable was already in the palm of his hand. A platform built on visibility. A platform where status could be measured in likes, comments, and followers. A platform where appearance could become reality. Instagram. And once Hushpuppi understood how to weaponize attention, everything changed. The question was no longer whether he had become wealthy. The real question was, how did he turn luxury into influence, and influence into fame? Instagram did not just give Hushpuppi visibility, it gave him power. At a time when social media was rapidly reshaping how people measured success, platforms like Instagram had become more than places to share photos. They had become stages, digital arenas where image could influence perception, where perception could influence reputation, and where reputation could open doors that might otherwise remain closed. Hushpuppi understood this better than most. He understood that people rarely see the full story. They see moments, snapshots, fragments, and those fragments are often enough to shape belief. So he began building something carefully, post by post, image by image, caption by caption, a persona. Not just the image of a wealthy man, but the image of a man living without limits. His page became a showcase of excess. Luxury shopping bags stacked on polished floors, designer outfits from some of the most exclusive brands in the world, custom jewelry, watches worth small fortunes, first-class travel, private jets, luxury suites overlooking city skylines, champagne dinners, VIP access, exotic locations. Every post carried the same message. Success had arrived, and it had arrived in spectacular fashion. The response was immediate. His following grew rapidly. Thousands became hundreds of thousands became millions. The engagement exploded. Comments poured in from across the world. Some praised him, some envied him, some questioned him. But whether people admired him or doubted him, one thing remained constant. They were watching. And attention, once captured at scale, becomes a powerful asset because attention creates influence. Influence creates authority, and authority creates trust. That trust became one of the most important elements of Hushpuppi's rise. The more people saw him surrounded by wealth, the less they questioned the source of that wealth. Something fascinating happens in human psychology. When we repeatedly see symbols of success, our brains begin filling in missing details. If someone flies private, we assume they must be successful. If someone wears luxury brands daily, we assume they must have legitimate income. If someone moves among the wealthy, we assume they belong there. Very few stop to ask the uncomfortable questions. What exactly does this person do? Where does the money come from? What business generates this lifestyle? Those questions often get drowned out by spectacle. And Hushpuppi mastered spectacle. His social media feed was more than personal branding. It was storytelling, a story millions wanted to believe. The story of a man who had escaped limitation, a man who had climbed into elite circles, a man who had won. To many followers, especially young people chasing financial success, Hushpuppi represented aspiration. He became proof, at least on the surface, that extreme wealth was possible, that luxury was attainable, that status could be earned. And this made him more than an influencer. He became symbolic. He embodied a dream, the dream of making it big, the dream of escaping struggle, the dream of being seen. And perhaps that was the genius of the persona he built. He did not simply display wealth, he sold hope, hope wrapped in designer labels, hope photographed inside luxury cars, hope framed against the backdrop of penthouses and private aviation. People did not just follow Hushpuppi because he was rich. They followed because he represented what many wished their own lives could become. But with influence came something else: credibility. As his status grew, so did the power of his image. The more successful he appeared, the more believable his success became. And once public perception accepts an image as truth, challenging that image becomes increasingly difficult. By then, Hushpuppi had become larger than an individual. He had become a brand, a luxury brand, a digital symbol of wealth, a carefully crafted empire built on visibility. And like many powerful illusions, the strength of that empire depended on one thing: belief. As long as people believed the image remained powerful. As long as followers admired the lifestyle reinforced itself. Every post strengthened the narrative, every like validated the persona, every comment amplified the myth. But myths become dangerous when nobody questions how they are built. Because while millions were double-tapping photos and leaving comments of admiration, investigators would later allege something entirely different was happening away from public view. While followers saw watches, someone else was tracing financial transactions. While followers saw luxury cars, someone else was examining digital evidence. While followers saw private jets, someone else was following money trails across borders. And this is where the story begins to shift. Because the glamorous public image was only one side of the narrative, there was another side, one that did not involve cameras, luxury hotels, or social media captions. A side built around emails, logins, digital identities, compromised systems, large transfers, and carefully orchestrated deception. The photos showed luxury, but investigators were beginning to focus on something else entirely: money movement, communication patterns, unusual transactions, suspicious activity. Piece by piece, a very different picture was starting to emerge, a picture that raised difficult questions, questions that could no longer be ignored. How was this empire really being funded? Who else was involved? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly was happening behind the image that millions had come to admire?
I want to come clean to you people. No laugh. Nobody should ask me for money. You see this place, this place, this place, this place. Now problem full now.
Every photo,
Problem.
every luxury post, every smiling picture in designer clothing. Something else was happening. Something that would eventually pull back the curtain on one of the most talked about fraud cases in recent memory. And once investigators started following that trail, they entered a world where trust itself had become a weapon. To understand the scale of what investigators were alleging, we need to understand the machine that powered it. Because the world Hushpuppi publicly presented was built around luxury, but the world investigators were examining revolved around something else entirely: digital deception, financial manipulation, and one of the most profitable forms of cybercrime in modern history: business email compromise, or BEC. At first glance, the term sounds technical, corporate, almost harmless, but behind those three words lies a fraud model that has stolen billions of dollars worldwide. And what makes it so effective is not advanced hacking alone. It is human psychology. It exploits something fundamental: trust. Not force, not violence, trust.
Email compromise seems really sophisticated, and during my career I've dealt with hundreds of these incidents. The bad guys are able to compromise an email account of a business.
It's a type of scam that targets companies and organizations for financial gain or data theft. Cybercriminals, they will typically compromise or spoof a legitimate email account and then send fraudulent emails to an addressee requesting transfer of funds or sensitive data, and they normally try and add some urgency to it as well. So, they will put some other information in there to make you think, oh, right, this is urgent.
And according to investigators, this was one of the central mechanisms behind the larger fraud network connected to Hushpuppi. To understand how it worked, break it into 4 stages: hack, observe, impersonate, steal, simple in structure, devastating in execution. Stage 1, hack. Everything begins with access. Criminal groups need a way inside. Sometimes they use phishing emails designed to trick employees into entering passwords. Sometimes they purchase stolen credentials from underground markets. Sometimes they exploit weak security systems. All they need is one opening, one compromised account, one mistake, one click. That single moment can unlock an entire organization, and that is what makes cybercrime so dangerous. Unlike traditional crime, the barrier to entry is often invisible. There is no broken door, no shattered glass, no alarm. An office can continue functioning normally while someone halfway across the world quietly watches everything. And that brings us to stage 2, observe. This is where patience becomes profitable. Once access is gained, the criminals often do not act immediately. They wait, they study, they watch, they read internal communications, emails between executives, invoices between vendors, legal correspondence, payment schedules, supplier relationships, approval chains, routine transactions. They begin learning how the company operates, who sends payment requests, who approves wire transfers, who handles finance, who can authorize large movements of money. Think of it like surveillance, except instead of watching a physical building, they are watching digital behavior. They are mapping trust. And over time, patterns emerge, patterns that reveal opportunity. They learn which conversations matter. They learn when payments are expected. They learn how urgency is communicated. And once they understand the rhythm of the organization, they move to the 3rd stage, impersonate. This is where deception becomes precision. The criminals do not announce themselves, they become someone else. A CEO, a lawyer, a trusted supplier, a financial executive, someone whose authority is rarely questioned. The fake email arrives, it looks legitimate. The branding matches, the writing style feels familiar, the timing feels normal. Nothing appears suspicious. Sometimes the only difference is a single letter in the email address, one character, one tiny change almost impossible to notice at first glance. Then comes the message: urgent payment request, updated banking details, confidential transaction, immediate action required. The email creates pressure, and pressure changes behavior. People under urgency make mistakes. They verify less, they assume more, they react faster. That is the real weapon. Not the hacked system, not the fake email. Pressure, because pressure short-circuits caution, and that leads to stage 4. Steal. The payment is approved, the transfer is made, the money moves, and within seconds, millions can disappear. No alarms, no dramatic confrontation, no armed robbery, just a transfer, a digital movement from one account to another. By the time the mistake is discovered, the money may already be fragmented across multiple accounts, layered, moved internationally, broken into smaller transfers, converted, disguised, washed through intermediaries. This is where fraud becomes far more sophisticated than simple theft. It becomes infrastructure, a system, a coordinated operation involving multiple players, money mules, shell companies, false identities, bank accounts spread across jurisdictions, each layer designed to make tracing more difficult, each transfer increasing distance between stolen funds and their original source. And this is where investigators began painting a larger picture. They were not looking at isolated scams, They were examining a network capable of operating at extraordinary scale, organized, methodical, highly disciplined. The victims were not random individuals. These were corporations, financial institutions, law firms, major businesses handling enormous transactions, targets with enough money that even a single successful attack could generate life-changing sums. And the numbers involved were staggering. Millions of dollars moving through carefully coordinated channels, money disappearing through systems built to exploit trust. That may be the most disturbing part of all, because when most people imagine crime, they imagine confrontation, a robbery, a weapon, a getaway, something loud, something visible. But crimes like this operate differently. They happen quietly, inside inboxes, inside spreadsheets, inside conversations between people who believe they are speaking to someone they trust. No guns, no masks, just deception. And according to federal investigators, this machine was not operating on a small scale. It had evolved into something much bigger, something international, something capable of moving extraordinary amounts of money. And soon, investigators would uncover allegations so massive they would force the world to look at Hushpuppi's empire very differently, because what came next was no longer about luxury posts, no longer about Instagram fame. It was about scale, and the amount of money investigators believed was moving through this network would leave even seasoned investigators stunned. By this point, investigators were no longer looking at isolated, fraudulent transactions. They were looking at movement, large-scale movement, money moving across countries, across financial systems, across identities, across jurisdictions. And the deeper investigators followed that trail, the more complex the picture became, because stolen money rarely stays in one place. It moves quickly, quietly, and strategically. Once funds were obtained through fraudulent transfers, the next challenge became obvious. How do you hide millions of dollars without attracting immediate attention? That question sits at the heart of money laundering, because stealing money is only part of the operation. Keeping it, using it, and disguising where it came from, that requires an entirely different system. And according to investigators, that system was both layered and sophisticated. Money was allegedly routed through multiple bank accounts, transferred across borders, broken into smaller amounts, moved through intermediaries, passed through shell companies, repackaged under false identities. Every layer created distance between the stolen funds and their origin, distance between the transaction and the people behind it, distance between evidence and accountability. And the more layers added to the chain, the harder it became to trace the full path. This is where shell companies became especially useful. On paper, a shell company can look legitimate. It can have a business name, registration documents, bank accounts, invoices, contracts, everything necessary to appear real. But in practice, some shell companies exist for one purpose: to move money while concealing ownership, to disguise control, to create confusion. Investigators examining these structures often face a maze. One company pays another, that company transfers to a third, the third routes funds internationally. A portion gets withdrawn, another portion buys assets, another disappears into accounts tied to different identities. Following the money becomes an exercise in patience, and that patience revealed something increasingly troubling: the scale. This was not petty fraud, this was not random online theft, this was a financial operation capable of handling enormous sums. Millions were allegedly moving through carefully constructed channels. Millions. Pause for a moment and think about that. Not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars moving through systems built to avoid detection. And as investigators continued building their case, one allegation stood out even among the others, because it revealed just how ambitious this network had allegedly become. Federal investigators described an attempted fraud involving an English Premier League football club. The amount involved was staggering, nearly $100 million, $100 million. The number alone was shocking. Even seasoned investigators understood what that figure represented. This was no longer a case of online scammers targeting individuals. This had entered a completely different category: high-level financial crime, the kind capable of disrupting major institutions, the kind requiring planning, coordination, technical knowledge, and operational discipline.
Requesting transfer of funds or sensitive data, and they normally try and add some urgency to it as well. So, they will put some other information in there to make you think, oh, right, this is urgent, I've got to act now. So it puts a bit of pressure on the person receiving that email.
A fraud attempt of that size raises serious questions. How many people were involved? Who handled access? Who managed communications? Who coordinated transfers? Who controlled the laundering channels? Because moving that level of money is not simple. It requires infrastructure, systems, people, specialized roles. And according to investigators, the operation reflected exactly that. An ecosystem, not chaos, not improvisation. An ecosystem designed to convert deception into wealth and wealth into legitimacy. That last part is crucial because money laundering is not only about hiding funds, it is also about transformation, turning suspicious money into respectable assets. Assets that appear clean, assets that blend into luxury. This is where lifestyle becomes part of the story. Luxury purchases can serve more than personal desire. They can also absorb capital, high-end watches, designer fashion, jewelry, luxury vehicles, exclusive travel, real estate. Each purchase can become another layer of separation. Stolen money becomes a watch. The watch becomes status. Status becomes credibility, and credibility reinforces the public image. This is what made the Hushpuppi story so fascinating to millions. The same luxury that attracted admiration also raised profound questions. Every expensive purchase strengthened two completely different narratives. To followers, it signaled success. To investigators, it became something else, potential evidence. That contrast lies at the center of this case. Two worlds existing simultaneously, one public, one hidden, one built on aspiration, one built on financial investigation, one celebrating wealth, one tracking suspicious transfers. And as these two worlds moved closer to collision, the stakes continued rising. Because investigators were no longer asking whether suspicious activity existed. They were trying to understand the size of the operation. How wide did the network extend? How many accounts were involved? How many identities were being used? How many collaborators remained invisible? The answers remained incomplete, but one conclusion was becoming difficult to ignore. This wasn't internet fraud anymore. This had become something far larger, something global, something organized, something powerful enough to generate extraordinary wealth while remaining largely hidden behind a carefully managed public image. And as investigators pushed deeper, the financial puzzle began revealing another disturbing truth. This empire may have been far bigger than the public ever imagined. Which raised a chilling question. If the money moving through this network was already this massive, just how large was the empire behind it? And how close were investigators to bringing it down? By now, one thing had become increasingly clear to investigators. This operation could not have been sustained by one person alone. Not at this scale, not across multiple countries, not with this level of coordination. The public often gravitates toward a single face, a single name, a single villain. It makes complicated stories easier to understand, but large financial crime operations rarely function that way. They depend on structure, hierarchy, roles, specialization, systems. And as investigators pieced together the evidence, they were not simply looking at suspicious transactions anymore. They were looking at what appeared to be an organized infrastructure, a machine with moving parts, each part serving a purpose, each person potentially handling a different responsibility, because operations involving millions of dollars do not run on improvisation. They require planning, precision, discipline, and above all, coordination. Think of it like a corporate organization, except this one operated in the shadows, of the financial system. At one end were the technical operators, the people responsible for gaining access, the ones who understood digital vulnerabilities, email systems, compromised credentials, security loopholes. These were the people who opened doors. Without them, nothing else could happen. Then came the observers. People whose job was patience. They monitored communications, studied behavior, mapped trust, tracked financial routines. They learned who approved payments, who responded under pressure, who handled sensitive transactions. Their value came from information, because in operations like these, information is leverage. The more you know, the more convincing the deception becomes. Then came the impersonators. This layer required a very different skill: communication, timing, psychology. These individuals understood how to manipulate urgency, how to sound authoritative, how to create pressure without raising suspicion. They knew how to exploit trust. They knew which words triggered immediate action. They knew how to make a fraudulent request feel legitimate. This stage required precision. One mistake could expose everything. One suspicious email could trigger internal verification. One careless message could collapse the operation, which meant whoever handled this stage understood human behavior remarkably well. But perhaps the most important layer sat further down the chain. The money movers. The people responsible for making stolen funds disappear into complexity.
The bad guys are able to compromise an email account of a business. Could be a small business, could be a large business, and it involves financial transactions.
This is where the infrastructure became especially sophisticated. Once funds landed in an account, the clock began ticking. The longer money remained stationary, the higher the risk. So movement became essential. Fast movement, strategic movement. Money flowed through accounts tied to individuals, companies, and intermediaries spread across jurisdictions. Some accounts received funds briefly before transferring them onward. Others served as temporary holding points. Some existed purely to create confusion. And then there were the identities. Real identities, false identities, borrowed identities, stolen identities. Every additional identity created another layer of separation, another wall between investigators and the individuals behind the transactions. This was not merely laundering, it was operational design, an architecture built around concealment, an architecture built around delay, because every extra layer forced investigators to spend more time, more resources, and more legal effort untangling the network. And time matters. In financial crime, time can mean everything. A delayed response can allow funds to vanish across multiple jurisdictions. A delayed warrant can mean devices disappear. A delayed investigation can allow collaborators to adapt, which raises one of the most important questions in the entire Hushpuppi case. How big was the network really? That question remains powerful because public attention often focuses on visible figures, the visible lifestyle, the visible luxury, the visible fame. But visible figures are not always the entire structure. Sometimes they are only the most recognizable part. The part people remember, the part cameras capture, the part headlines amplify. That creates a difficult challenge for investigators. How do you measure the true size of a network when much of its structure is designed specifically to remain invisible? How many collaborators were directly involved? How many operated indirectly? How many understood the full scale? How many only knew their specific role? These questions mattered because the evidence increasingly suggested this operation extended beyond simple partnerships. It looked systemic, a coordinated criminal infrastructure capable of generating, moving, and disguising enormous wealth. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all was how seamlessly that infrastructure appeared to coexist with ordinary life. Luxury dinners, travel, fashion, social media, public admiration, all of it existed on the surface. while underneath, investigators believed a far more complex machine was operating, a machine that relied on secrecy, timing, and carefully structured financial movement. And as investigators continued tracing the network, following digital trails, and connecting evidence across borders, the pressure began closing in. Slowly at first, then rapidly, the walls were narrowing. The digital footprints were accumulating, patterns were becoming clearer. Evidence was strengthening. And somewhere within that expanding web of transactions, devices, and communications, investigators believed they were getting closer to something critical. Not just the money, not just the network, the people behind it. And once law enforcement believed they had enough to move, everything changed, because the empire that had operated through layers of deception was about to face something it could not manipulate, a coordinated international operation. And when that moment came, the illusion began to collapse. For months, investigators had been assembling pieces of a puzzle that at first seemed almost impossible to fully comprehend. Financial records, transaction histories, communication logs, IP traces, banking activity, device metadata, wire transfers, digital footprints scattered across borders. Individually, each piece told only part of the story, but together they began revealing something much larger. Patterns, connections, relationships, movement. The more investigators analyzed the evidence, the clearer the picture became. This was no longer about isolated, suspicious transactions. This was a case built on accumulation, small details layered over time, a transfer here, an email there, a login from one jurisdiction, a payment routed through another. What once looked disconnected gradually began aligning. And as those connections strengthened, so did law enforcement's confidence that they were dealing with a highly organized financial crime operation. By 2020, investigators had spent months following the money, months studying communications, months tracing digital activity, every warrant executed, every record subpoenaed, every device analyzed. Each step narrowed the gap between suspicion and action. And eventually the investigation reached a critical point. There comes a moment in major investigations when observation is no longer enough. A point where watching must give way to movement, where evidence collection turns into operational execution. That moment had arrived. Dubai, June 2020. The city was known for wealth, luxury, and excess. Glass towers pierced the skyline, luxury cars filled the streets, elite lifestyles blended into a city built around ambition and status. Somewhere inside that world sat one of the most recognizable symbols of online luxury. The image was still intact, the persona still powerful. To millions watching online, nothing appeared broken. The posts still reflected wealth, the lifestyle still projected success, the empire still looked untouchable. But beneath that image, events were already in motion. Law enforcement had made its decision. The operation was ready. Then came the raid. In coordinated fashion, officers moved toward the luxury apartment. Every second mattered. Timing mattered. Surprise mattered. Control mattered. Operations like this are built around one core objective: secure the target before evidence disappears. Because in cybercrime investigations, physical evidence can vanish quickly. A device can be wiped, data can be encrypted, files can be deleted, accounts can be accessed remotely. Seconds matter. As officers advanced toward the apartment, months of investigation were converging into one decisive moment. This was the point where digital evidence would meet physical reality. The hallway tightened, commands were issued, positions were taken, and then entry. The apartment was breached. What officers entered looked exactly like the lifestyle millions had admired online. Luxury everywhere, designer fashion, exclusive accessories, expensive electronics, custom jewelry, luxury watches, high-end bags. Every room reflected extraordinary wealth. Everything looked polished, curated, elite. At first glance, it looked like success, the kind of success social media celebrates, the kind that fuels admiration and aspiration. But investigators were not there to admire wealth, they were there to secure evidence. The search began immediately. Phones were seized, laptops collected, hard drives secured, digital storage devices catalogued, financial documents gathered, encrypted devices taken into custody. Each item mattered, because in cases like this, evidence does not always announce itself. Sometimes the most important breakthrough sits inside an ordinary-looking device. A message thread, an email chain, a transfer record, a wallet address, a contact list. One file can connect multiple jurisdictions. One device can expose years of activity. And as the evidence collection continued, the scale of the operation became harder to ignore. Luxury cars were linked to the investigation, high-value assets were catalogued, items associated with extreme wealth were now being examined under a completely different lens. A watch was no longer just a watch, a car was no longer just a car, a luxury bag was no longer just fashion. Each asset raised the same question. Was this purchased with legitimate wealth or with stolen money? That question changed everything. Because once wealth becomes evidence, perception changes instantly. Objects that once inspired admiration begin attracting scrutiny. Symbols of status become potential symbols of laundering. And that shift happened in real time. The public image that had taken years to build began collapsing in hours. News of the arrests spread rapidly. Social media exploded, shock, disbelief, debate. Some refused to believe the allegations. Others claimed the warning signs had always existed. Supporters defended him. Critics felt vindicated. The internet became a battlefield of opinions. But beneath all the reactions, one reality had become unavoidable. The illusion had finally cracked. The carefully curated empire that had commanded admiration from millions was no longer protected by luxury, influence, or visibility. Because once law enforcement steps into the picture, perception becomes secondary. Evidence becomes everything. And as the world processed the images coming out of Dubai, another question began to grow louder. Was this the end of the story, or only the beginning of something much bigger? Because even after the arrests, even after the seizures, but even after the raid, investigators still faced one enormous question. Had they captured the mastermind, or only one visible piece of a much larger machine? The raid in Dubai marked a turning point, but it was not the end of the investigation. In many ways, it was the beginning of a new phase, because arrests create headlines, evidence builds cases, and cases eventually move into courtrooms where narratives are no longer shaped by social media, public opinion, or speculation. They are shaped by documents, charges, statements, financial records, digital evidence, and legal strategy. After the arrest, attention shifted toward the United States Department of Justice. Federal prosecutors had been building a case centered on allegations of large-scale financial fraud and money laundering. The evidence they had gathered painted a detailed picture of an operation that allegedly moved substantial sums through sophisticated channels designed to conceal the origin of funds. Investigators were no longer dealing with assumptions. They were presenting allegations supported by digital trails, communication records, banking activity, transaction histories. And the deeper the public looked into the legal filings, the clearer the scale of the case became. This was not framed as a simple fraud allegation. Prosecutors described something far more organized, a conspiracy. That word carries weight because conspiracy suggests coordination, multiple actors, shared objectives, a network, not isolated behavior, not accidental involvement, coordination, intent, structure. The central allegation focused on conspiracy to engage in money laundering. That meant the legal focus extended beyond simply obtaining money through fraud. It addressed what happened after the money moved, how funds were handled, how they were transferred, how they were concealed, how they were integrated into assets and financial systems. This distinction matters. Fraud generates illicit funds. Money laundering attempts to make those funds appear legitimate. And according to prosecutors, that laundering process was central to the case. Then came one of the most important moments in the entire story, the guilty plea. In 2021, Hushpuppi pleaded guilty to conspiracy to engage in money laundering. The announcement sent shockwaves across the internet. For years, public discussion around Hushpuppi had been filled with speculation, questions, rumors, defenses, criticism, support, doubt. But a guilty plea changed the conversation dramatically because it moved the story from allegation to legal admission. For many observers, that moment shattered the final barrier between image and reality. The luxury lifestyle that had once symbolized success was now viewed through a completely different lens. Every old image carried new meaning. The watches, the cars, the hotels, the designer clothing, the private travel, all of it was re-examined. The same photos that once inspired admiration now triggered uncomfortable questions. How much of that wealth was legitimate? How much was tied to illicit money? How much of the public image had been sustained by financial deception? Public reaction was intense. Across social media, debates exploded. Some expressed disappointment, others expressed anger, many felt stunned. For some followers, the story felt deeply personal, because Hushpuppi had represented more than luxury. He had represented aspiration, success, possibility, the idea that extraordinary wealth could be achieved and displayed unapologetically. For supporters who believed in that image, the guilty plea forced a painful reckoning. It challenged years of belief. It challenged admiration. It challenged trust. And trust, once broken, changes everything. But even as the guilty plea brought legal clarity, it did not answer every question. In fact, it intensified some of the most important ones. Because the more investigators revealed about the scale and sophistication of the operation, the harder one question became to ignore. Could a network of this size truly revolve around one individual? That question remains central to the Hushpuppi story. Major financial crime operations rarely depend entirely on a single person. They rely on infrastructure, access, communication, operational discipline, financial channels, specialized roles. That reality kept one possibility alive in public discussion. What if Hushpuppi was not the architect of the entire system? What if he was only one visible component, one recognizable face inside a much larger structure? That possibility shifts the entire narrative, because if true, then the story is no longer only about one man's rise and fall. It becomes a story about networks, about systems, about the hidden architecture of global cybercrime. And that brings us to perhaps the most unsettling question of all. Was Hushpuppi the mastermind, or just one piece? Because if he was only one piece, then somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the court filings, and beyond public attention, other pieces may still remain in place, still connected, still active, still hidden. By the time the headlines began to fade, most people believed the story had reached its conclusion. The arrests had happened, the evidence had been presented, the guilty plea had been entered. For many, the case appeared closed, another high-profile criminal brought down, another scandal consumed by the endless cycle of global news. The story filed away. But major investigations rarely end as neatly as public headlines suggest, because headlines tend to simplify. They compress complex investigations into recognizable narratives: a rise, a fall, an arrest, a conviction, closure. But reality is often far more complicated. And the deeper you examine the Hushpuppi case, the more difficult it becomes to ignore one uncomfortable truth. This story may never have been about one man alone. That possibility forces us to widen the lens, to step back from the celebrity, the luxury, and the social media persona. Because once you remove the face that captured public attention, what remains is something much larger. An ecosystem, a global cybercrime economy that continues to evolve faster than many institutions can respond. This is the part of the story that receives far less attention. Most people understand cybercrime only through individual incidents, a hacked email, a stolen password, a fraudulent transfer. But modern cybercrime has become industrialized. It operates with structure, with specialization, with supply chains. There are actors who focus only on initial access. Their job is simple: find vulnerabilities, compromise systems, sell access. There are others who specialize in credential theft. Some specialize in phishing campaigns. Some build malware. Some handle communications. Some move money. Some clean money. Some recruit money mules. Some create shell companies. Some operate entirely in financial laundering networks without ever touching the original fraud. Each layer reduces exposure. Each layer protects higher-level actors. Each layer increases operational efficiency. In other words, what many people imagine as isolated cybercrime often resembles an underground industry, an industry built on trust, reputation, and profit. That is what makes cases like Hushpuppi so important. They offer a rare glimpse into how visible wealth can intersect with invisible criminal infrastructure, and yet even rare glimpses show only fragments. Investigators can uncover accounts, trace transfers, recover devices, map communications, but networks adapt, they evolve. When one pathway closes, another opens. When one operation is disrupted, others continue. That adaptability is one of the greatest challenges facing global law enforcement. Cybercrime does not depend on physical borders the way traditional crime often does. A victim may be in one country, an attacker in another, servers in a third, funds routed through several more. Each jurisdiction adds complexity. If Hushpuppi was the mastermind, then this story becomes the rise and collapse of one highly visible empire. But if he was only one piece, then a far more disturbing possibility emerges, that the larger machine may still exist, still operating, still adapting, still evolving. Somewhere beyond public visibility, beyond headlines, beyond the reach of casual attention, and that possibility should make all of us pause. Because perhaps the greatest danger in the digital age is not simply fraud itself. It is how convincingly deception can disguise itself as success, how easily image can overpower scrutiny, how quickly admiration can silence questions. In a world driven by visibility, wealth often earns trust before it earns scrutiny. And that may be the most powerful lesson in this entire case. Not everything that shines is legitimate. Not every symbol of success tells the full story. And not every empire is built on what it appears to be. The official case may be closed, but the bigger network may still be out there, hidden behind screens, hidden behind wealth, hidden behind influence, waiting, adapting, expanding. So now we leave the question with you. Do you believe Hushpuppi was truly the mastermind behind this empire? Or was he only one face in a much larger network? Let us know what you think in the comments, because sometimes the most revealing part of a case isn't what investigators prove. It's what still remains unanswered. This is Crime Archive, real cases, hidden truths, untold stories.